The rain fell sideways across the Scottish hills, cold, relentless, slicing through fabric and flesh alike. 100 young Americans moved through the mud in silence, each step heavier than the last. Their boots sank deep into the earth, their breath forming small ghosts in the wind. 11 kilometers. That was the rule. 11 kilometers before sunrise. 11 kilometers before breakfast. 11 kilometers to find out who would survive the war that had not yet begun for them. The instructors didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their silence was worse. Every stumble, every glance backward, every hint of hesitation was met with a look, not of anger but of disappointment, that somehow cut deeper. Here, on the barren plains of Scotland, ordinary men were being burned down to their core, until only steel remained. It wasn't punishment. It was transformation. The United States Army Rangers, born from the crucible of desperation, were not trained to survive. They were trained to win, to move faster, hit harder, and think sharper than any enemy they would face. Every breath of this place reeked of damp wool, gun oil, and fear. The kind of fear that wasn't loud or panicked, but quiet, disciplined, the kind that a man carries inside when he knows there's no easy way out. By 1942, America had entered a war unlike any it had ever known. A war that stretched across oceans, mountains, and jungles, where no corner of the earth seemed untouched by violence. The factories in Detroit thundered night and day. Women welded steel, men volunteered in droves, and the promise of victory became the only dream that mattered. But dreams don't win wars. Men do. And to forge those men, America built its own version of hell. In the beginning, few believed these boys could ever become soldiers worthy of the fight ahead. Many came straight from the plains of Kansas or the neighborhoods of Brooklyn, farmhands and factory workers barely old enough to shave. They carried letters from mothers in their pockets and photos of girls waiting back home. But within weeks, those same hands that once turned wrenches or picked corn were now blistered from rifles, bleeding from bayonets, and trembling from exhaustion. The training was designed to break them, not to test their strength but to measure their will. They climbed rope walls slick with rain, crawled under barbed wire as machine guns fired live rounds inches above their heads. One mistake, one careless move, and the price was blood. When a man fell, no one helped him up. The rule was simple: stand or stay down. Because on the battlefield, mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Every night, they collapsed into their cots, soaked, bruised, half-starved. And yet, every dawn they rose again. That's what made them dangerous. Across the Atlantic, the British commandos had already earned their reputation for bold, surgical strikes against Nazi-occupied Europe. They moved like shadows, hit hard, and vanished before dawn. The American officers studying them took notes, and then took it further. They built a training system that didn't just copy the British style but surpassed it. Longer marches. Heavier packs. Less sleep. No second chances. In the forests of Achnacarry Castle, men learned to kill silently, to endure pain without complaint, and to trust only those who could keep up. They were told again and again, the more you sweat here, the less you bleed there. It wasn't a slogan. It was survival. And as word spread, the myth of the American Ranger began to form, part soldier, part ghost, entirely unbreakable. One recruit later wrote, "We stopped thinking of ourselves as men. We became weapons. Not machines but something worse. Machines break. We didn't." That was the point. The brutality of their training mirrored the brutality of the war they were about to face. On D-Day, when Rangers scaled the cliffs of Point du Hoc under German fire, it wasn't luck or courage that got them to the top. It was this: the agony, the discipline, the nights they spent crawling through mud in Scotland. Every inch up those cliffs was paid for months in advance. But the Rangers were only the beginning. Across the United States, an entire generation of soldiers was being reshaped by a philosophy that bordered on madness. If war was merciless, training had to be worse. In the deserts of California, infantrymen marched until their feet bled, learning to move and fight in blistering heat. In the swamps of Louisiana, they battled exhaustion, humidity, and swarms of insects so thick that men tied rags around their faces just to breathe. In the frozen fields of Minnesota, new recruits were taught how to keep fighting when the mercury dropped below zero, how to light a fire with shaking hands, how to aim a rifle when fingers were numb and stiff. Every environment, every hardship, every misery was part of the plan. Because the truth was simple: America couldn't afford to lose. By 1943, the tide of the war was uncertain. Germany had conquered most of Europe. Japan ruled the Pacific. The Allies needed not just numbers but endurance, soldiers who could outlast the enemy when strength and ammunition ran out. That meant transforming civilians into soldiers, soldiers into warriors, and warriors into survivors. Each morning, drill sergeants reminded their men that comfort was the enemy of victory. Food was rationed. Sleep was a privilege. Pain was a teacher. And in time the lesson took root. They stopped flinching at gunfire. They stopped complaining about the cold. They learned that fear was something you carried with you, but never showed. What drove them wasn't patriotism alone. It was pride. Pride in being tougher than the man beside you, in proving that no obstacle could break you. And beneath all that, something deeper began to take shape. A quiet belief that if they could survive the training, they could survive anything. That belief became a weapon. On the parade grounds of Camp Toccoa, young men shouted a motto that would define them: Kerhi, we stand alone together. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, later known as the Band of Brothers, ran up Kerhi Mountain every day, 3 miles up, 3 miles down, until their lungs felt like they were on fire. When they finally jumped into Normandy on D-Day, scattered across fields and hedgerows, that pain came back to save them. Every mile run. Every blister earned. Every insult, every punishment. It had all been preparing them for that moment. The chaos, the confusion, the cold terror of landing behind enemy lines in the dark. That was the genius of American training. It wasn't just about building soldiers. It was about breaking the illusion of safety. Because in war, safety didn't exist. The Marine Corps took that lesson even further. On the beaches of Camp Pendleton and the islands of the Pacific, Marines trained with live ammunition. Real explosions, real casualties. Their instructors didn't tell them what war was like. They showed them. When the first waves of Marines landed on Guadalcanal in 1942, they faced jungles thick with disease, enemy fire, and starvation. But the training had already stripped away weakness. They fought not for medals or glory, but because that's what they had been built to do. Their endurance became legend. And so, the question lingered: how far can a man be pushed before he breaks? The answer, as the war would prove, was farther than anyone imagined. Because out of those mud-soaked camps and fire-blackened ranges came men who would walk through hell itself and keep going. Men who would storm beaches, climb cliffs, and fight for inches of ground as if the world depended on it. And in a way it did. If you've ever wondered why America won the war, why its soldiers fought with such relentless resolve, the answer isn't just in the battles they won. It's in the brutal mornings before those battles, in the marches through freezing rain, in the nights without sleep. That's where victory was forged. That's where boys became men, and men became something more. It's hard to imagine now, in an age of comfort and convenience, what it meant to endure what they did. But maybe that's why their story still matters. Because history isn't written by those who survive. It's written by those who refuse to quit. And if you want to understand how America built an army that could change the course of the world, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and step back into the forge where heroes were made. The morning began with a whistle, shrill, sharp, slicing through the cold like a blade. It was 4 a.m. and the men were already awake. No one spoke. They knew what came next. The sound of boots hitting the ground was a rhythm now, not chaos. 100 men breathing as one. Their muscles screamed, their bodies protested, but their minds were quiet. Pain had become background noise. By now, they understood what the instructors had meant from day one. You will not rise to the occasion. You will fall to the level of your training. Those words haunted them. And then they began to believe them. Every soldier knew that when the bullets started flying, there would be no time to think, no time to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Only muscle memory. Only instinct. Only what the training had burned into him. Across the ocean, those instincts were being tested in real combat. In North Africa, under the blinding sun and swirling dust, the first major American campaigns were underway. It was here, among the dunes and ravines, that America learned how costly inexperience could be. At Kasserine Pass in early 1943, untested American troops faced seasoned German veterans of the Afrika Korps, men hardened by years of war under Rommel's command. The desert became a graveyard of arrogance. The Americans were pushed back, routed, and humiliated. Equipment was abandoned, communications broke down, and morale shattered. But within that defeat lay the seed of transformation. Because America doesn't stay broken for long. In the aftermath, new commanders took charge, men like General George S. Patton. Brutal, brilliant, and uncompromising. Patton didn't believe in excuses. He believed in excellence. He arrived in North Africa like a storm. His first order of business: rebuild discipline. He ordered soldiers to shave every morning, polish their helmets, keep their uniforms spotless, even in the middle of the desert. To the men it seemed absurd. But Patton knew exactly what he was doing. Cleanliness, precision, attention to detail, these weren't about appearance. They were about control. About pride. About building men who would follow orders under fire without hesitation. He drilled them relentlessly. Forced marches in scorching heat. Live-fire exercises that mimicked battle conditions. He turned chaos into choreography. And when his army met the Germans again, the difference was night and day. By the time the Allies invaded Sicily in 1943, the American military was no longer an amateur force. It had become a machine, sharp, coordinated, and unflinching. But there was still one frontier that tested men beyond reason: the human mind. Fear is a strange thing in war. It doesn't always come from the enemy's gunfire. Sometimes it's born in silence, in the long waits between battles, in the moments when a man is left alone with his thoughts. That's why the next phase of training wasn't just physical. It was psychological. The United States began experimenting with programs designed to harden not just the body but the mind. Recruits were deprived of sleep, exposed to simulated chaos, forced to make decisions under extreme stress. They were trained to lead, even when every instinct told them to hide. At Fort Benning, officers and enlisted men alike faced problem-solving under fire drills. Explosions, screams, confusion, all engineered to test whether a soldier could think while terrified. Because war, they learned, is 90% confusion and 10% courage. Meanwhile, across the country, another kind of warrior was being molded. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's first true intelligence agency, was training men to fight wars without front lines. These weren't regular soldiers. They were saboteurs, spies, assassins. They learned to kill silently, to blend in, to vanish. At a secret camp in Maryland, codenamed Area B, OSS trainees practiced knife fighting, unarmed combat, demolition, and silent infiltration. Their instructors included British commandos, martial artists, and even stage magicians, masters of deception. It was warfare distilled to its purest form: strike fast, disappear, and never be seen again. These were the men who would later inspire America's Special Operations Units, the Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, the Delta Force. But the most extraordinary of them all might have been a small, obscure group called the Alamo Scouts. Operating deep behind Japanese lines in the Pacific, they carried out more than 100 missions: reconnaissance, sabotage, prisoner rescues, and not a single one of them was killed in action. Not one. That kind of perfection doesn't come from luck. It comes from training so intense that failure is simply no longer an option. While the OSS mastered stealth, the Marines continued to master endurance. On the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, they fought an enemy that refused to surrender. Japanese soldiers hid in tunnels and caves, emerging only to die in suicidal charges. The heat was unbearable, the air filled with sulfur and smoke, and the ground shook constantly from artillery. Every inch of that island was earned through blood and sweat. But what's remarkable is how those Marines fought, not as individuals but as one organism. Every man moved with a kind of instinctual unity. It wasn't luck or chaos. It was discipline drilled into them from the first day of boot camp. Their training had taught them that hesitation kills, that victory belongs to those who act without fear. And fear by then had become a choice. They learned to breathe through it, to move through it, to fight even when every part of their body screamed to run. By late 1944, the Allied armies were advancing on all fronts. Europe was burning and the Pacific was bleeding. The world was exhausted. But America somehow kept moving forward. That momentum came from something no enemy could see: the invisible armor of relentless preparation. A private might not have known the grand strategy of the war, but he knew how to dig a trench in the rain, how to keep his rifle dry, how to march 20 miles without water. He knew how to endure. And that endurance became America's secret weapon. Even in moments of chaos there was order. Even in fear there was focus. When paratroopers jumped into France under the glow of tracer fire, when Marines stormed beaches under machine gun nests, when tank crews burned alive inside steel coffins, what kept them moving wasn't courage alone. It was habit. Hardwired, automatic, unbreakable habit. The training had worked. But behind that success there was a darker truth. The cost of creating perfect soldiers was the destruction of the individual. The man who entered training was not the same man who came out. Somewhere between exhaustion and obedience, something human was lost. Instructors called it discipline. Psychologists called it conditioning. But for the men themselves, it was something stranger, a hollowing out, a transformation they couldn't undo. One Marine later said, "They took away everything that made us soft. And when they were done, there wasn't much left except what they needed, a man who would kill on command." That's the paradox of war. To survive it, you must become part of it. And America's training had achieved exactly that. Still, for all its brutality, it gave the world something it desperately needed: men who could stand in the face of chaos and not look away. Men who didn't need to be told what to do when everything fell apart. As 1945 approached, victory was within sight. But the final battles, in Europe's frozen forests and the Pacific's infernos, would demand more than strength. They would demand everything. And for that, America had prepared them well. The forge was complete. The weapons were ready. All that remained was to unleash them. Snow fell across the Ardennes like a silent curtain, covering the world in white. The forest was still, but underneath that quiet, death waited. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble, had begun. American soldiers dug into frozen ground, their fingers numb, their uniforms soaked through. The temperature dropped below zero, ammunition froze, rifles jammed. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were gone. And still they fought. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and nearly cut off. But they didn't break. Because they couldn't. Every mile they had marched, every sleepless night, every screaming drill sergeant had prepared them for this. For the moment when everything else failed but their will. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division held the line under constant shelling. When the Germans sent a message demanding surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe sent back one word: nuts. It was the kind of defiance that defined the American spirit: reckless, unyielding, and utterly fearless. Those men didn't just survive the siege. They became a symbol. Proof that American training had done what it was meant to do: take ordinary men and make them impossible to break. While Europe froze, half a world away, another hell unfolded in the Pacific. The jungles of the Philippines, the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima, the coral reefs of Okinawa. Each place became a nightmare of endurance. The terrain itself was the enemy. The Japanese fought to the last man. There were no front lines, no safe zones. Every bush could hide a sniper, every cave a grenade. The Marines learned to sleep with one eye open, to step lightly, to listen for the faintest movement in the dark. This was war stripped to its bones: no glory, no banners, just survival. And yet, through that chaos, the American machine kept grinding forward. The same men who once cursed their instructors now understood. The endless drills, the live-fire exercises, the forced marches, it had all been for this. The body remembered even when the mind was numb. They learned to act without hesitation. When the landing crafts hit the beach, when the ramps dropped and the bullets started flying, they didn't stop to think. They moved. Move or die, that was the rule. At Iwo Jima, the black volcanic ash swallowed boots and blood alike. Marines clawed their way up Mount Suribachi under constant fire. Many didn't make it. But those who did planted the flag not just for victory, but for every man who had endured the forge that brought them there. The photo of that flag raising became immortal. But the truth behind it was not heroism, it was exhaustion. It was discipline. It was the product of pain. War by then had consumed everything. The Pacific burned. Europe crumbled. But what kept the American war machine alive wasn't luck or numbers. It was faith, not in God, not in fate, but in preparation. Every soldier knew, when everything around you falls apart, you fall back on what you know. And what they knew was how to fight, how to endure, how to outlast. That's why the Allied advance never stopped. From Normandy to the Rhine, from Tarawa to Okinawa, America's soldiers kept pushing forward. They weren't the strongest men in the world, or the bravest, or the most experienced, but they were the most prepared. Every nation fights differently. The Germans fought with precision. The Japanese fought with fanaticism. The Russians fought with sheer numbers. But the Americans, they fought with adaptability. That adaptability was born in their training. It wasn't enough to memorize orders or perfect drills. They were taught to improvise, to make decisions when communication failed, to lead when leaders fell. Instructors called it initiative under fire. It was one of the Army's most sacred principles, that every man, no matter his rank, must be capable of thinking like a commander when the moment demanded it. On the slopes of Monte la Difensa in Italy, the 1st Special Service Force, the Devil's Brigade, put that philosophy to the test. Composed of American and Canadian troops, the brigade was trained in every kind of warfare imaginable: mountain climbing, parachuting, demolition, hand-to-hand combat. Their training regimen was so grueling that nearly half the volunteers dropped out before completing it. But those who stayed became legends. At Monte la Difensa, they scaled cliffs thought impossible to climb, attacking from angles the enemy never anticipated. When dawn broke, they had taken the mountain in a single night, something entire divisions had failed to do. The Germans called them the Black Devils, because they fought like ghosts, silent, merciless, appearing out of nowhere and disappearing just as quickly. Their success was not luck. It was the result of a philosophy that defined the American way of war: overcome the impossible by training for it long before the battle begins. Every skill had been rehearsed. Every scenario, imagined. Every failure already survived in training. That mindset changed everything. For the first time, war was not just fought with weapons, but with preparation itself. The Devil's Brigade showed that the American soldier could be more than a cog in a machine. He could be a weapon of creativity. A man who could adapt faster than the enemy could react. And that was America's greatest strength. It wasn't just the tanks or planes or factories. It was the ability to turn chaos into order, fear into focus, pain into progress. When the Rangers stormed Point du Hoc, when the Marines held the line at Guadalcanal, when the paratroopers dropped into France, it wasn't brute force that won the day. It was discipline forged from suffering. Because America understood something most armies didn't: comfort breeds weakness. Hardship breeds victory. Even back home, civilians began to understand this truth. War bond posters showed muscular soldiers, jaws set, eyes hard. Training footage was shown in theaters, not to glorify violence, but to prove that America was building something unstoppable. And it worked. By late 1944, the U.S. military had become the most effective fighting force on Earth. From the factories to the front lines, every part of the nation moved in perfect rhythm, a symphony of production, training, and willpower. But that kind of perfection came at a price. Many of the men who survived would never truly return. The discipline that had saved them in war often trapped them in peace. They found themselves unable to rest, unable to stop moving, as if the war had rewired their very souls. Their bodies came home, but part of them stayed behind, still marching, still listening for that whistle in the dark. Because when you live long enough inside the forge, the fire becomes part of you. And for America, that fire would never go out. The day of truth came with a whisper, not a roar. In the grey dawn of June 6, 1944, the men who had been forged on the cliffs of Scotland now faced the cliffs of Normandy. They stood on the decks of small landing craft, the sea foaming around them, their faces pale in the weak morning light. The training was over. The real test had begun. For months they had imagined this moment: the roar of engines, the hiss of bullets, the cold weight of fear pressing down on their chests. Now it was real. The Rangers' orders were clear: climb Point du Hoc, destroy the German guns, and hold until relieved. The sea was cruel that morning. The waves tossed the boats like toys. Many were already seasick before the first shot was fired. But none of that mattered. They had trained for this. Every second on those cliffs in Scotland had led to this one. Then came the command: get ready. The ramps dropped, and hell opened up. Machine gun fire tore into the air, snapping past their helmets, shredding the water around them into fountains of death. Men dove forward, tripping, stumbling, pushing through the icy surf as bullets found flesh. The air smelled of salt, gunpowder, and terror. And then they began to climb. The cliffs of Normandy were twice as high as the ones in Scotland, slick with rain and blood. The ropes swung wildly, cut by enemy fire. Men fell, screaming into the sea below. But others kept going. One hand over the other. One breath at a time. Up the rock toward the fire. They had done this 100 times before, in darkness, in rain, with empty stomachs and burning muscles. But this time it was real. Grenades burst above them. Snipers picked off climbers one by one. Still they climbed. "Keep moving," someone shouted. "Don't stop." And they didn't. By the time the first Rangers reached the top, half their number was gone. The Germans waited, throwing grenades down the cliffs, firing point blank. But the men from Scotland, the ones who had learned to fight with nothing but grit, met them head-on. They fought hand-to-hand, room to room, trench to trench. For 2 long days they held Point du Hoc with no food, no water, and no reinforcements. They used captured weapons, scavenged ammunition, and sheer willpower to survive. When relief finally arrived, only 90 men were still able to fight. The rest were dead or wounded. But the guns, the ones that could have slaughtered thousands on Omaha Beach, were gone. The Rangers had done it. They had completed the mission that everyone thought was impossible. And when the news reached General Omar Bradley, he said just one thing: the Rangers led the way. Those words became their legacy, and their curse. Because leading the way meant they would always be the first into danger. After Normandy, the survivors fought again, at Brest, in the Hurtgen forest, across Germany. They stormed bunkers, cleared towns, and paid in blood for every mile gained. But nothing would ever compare to that climb, the moment when training met destiny. In the chaos of war, many of them found themselves thinking back to Scotland. To the cliffs where they'd first learned to defy gravity. To the sergeants who'd screamed until their voices broke. One man said later, "When I hit the cliffs at Normandy, I could still hear them, the instructors. Every curse, every order, every threat. And it saved my life." That was the secret truth behind their success. It wasn't just courage. It was preparation, the kind that pushed human limits until the impossible became routine. They had been broken down to nothing and then rebuilt into something unstoppable. Even when their bodies failed, their will didn't. And as the war dragged on, as friends fell and the maps changed, that will became their armor. In the ruins of France, one young ranger carried a small notebook, filled with names. Every man from his squad who had fallen since D-Day. At night, he would open it, whisper each name aloud and say the same thing: "Still leading the way." The phrase meant more than a motto. It was a promise. That no matter how hard the fight, someone would always step forward. Someone would always climb. By the winter of 1944, the Rangers were exhausted. Their ranks were thin, their nerves frayed. But when the Battle of the Bulge began, they were sent in again, because if the job was impossible, it was theirs. Through snow and ice, they fought their way across Belgium, ambushing armored columns, defending towns, rescuing trapped units. And every time they faltered, every time they doubted they could go on, they remembered the cliffs. That wind. That rain. That voice shouting, "You will climb or you will die trying." They had already died 1,000 times in training. Now they refused to die in war. It was no longer about orders. It was about each other. About the men beside them, the ones who had shared the same mud, the same pain, the same laughter in the dark. And when victory finally came, when the German lines broke and silence fell, they didn't cheer. They just stood there breathing hard, knowing it was over. The road from Scotland to Normandy had taken them across oceans and through hell itself. But they had survived. Barely. They were no longer the same men who had stood on those cliffs, laughing at the storm. They had become something rarer, proof that human will can defy fate. And somewhere in the back of every ranger's mind, as the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, there was the faintest echo of that first day of training. The cliffs, the rain, the wind, and the voice that started it all. Again. Climb again. They had climbed once more, and this time for real. They came home quietly. There were no parades waiting for them at the docks, no roaring crowds or waving flags. Only silence, the kind that feels heavier than any sound. Their ships slid into American harbors, gray against gray, carrying men who looked older than their years. They were Rangers, Marines, paratroopers, survivors of a world that had been on fire. For months they had lived in chaos. Every instinct had been sharpened by danger. Every breath had been a decision between life and death. And now the war was over. But inside them the battle still raged. The army called it demobilization. The men called it something else, forgetting how to be normal. They walked down the gangways with stiff backs and hollow eyes. Some carried scars, others carried ghosts. All carried memories they would never speak of. At the stations and piers, families waited. Mothers, wives, children. They smiled through tears, reaching out for the sons and husbands they'd prayed for. But when they embraced them they found strangers. The men who had left were gone. In their place stood soldiers, quiet, watchful, distant. The war had taught them too well how to feel nothing. And yet, America celebrated. Victory had come. The flag flew high and the factories roared again. But in the shadows of that triumph, the veterans carried a different kind of burden. Some found peace in work, in family, in the slow rhythm of ordinary life. Others couldn't. They missed the noise, the purpose, the unity of the fight. They couldn't explain to anyone what it meant to live on the edge of existence, to wake each day knowing it could be your last, and then to come home where everything was safe, clean, and quiet. One ranger years later said, "The hardest thing wasn't Normandy. It was learning to sleep again without the sound of waves and gunfire." In small towns across the country, the veterans gathered in VFW halls and Legion posts. They didn't talk much about the battles. They talked about training, about Scotland, about the cliffs, about the instructors who had turned them from boys into steel. They laughed about the cold, the mud, the endless runs that felt like torture. Because now they understood. It hadn't been cruelty. It had been preparation. Those days on the cliffs had been the crucible, the place where they had shed their fears and found their will to survive. And in that realization lay a strange kind of peace. For them, the war had not been won by luck or by numbers alone. It had been won by endurance, by the ability to keep moving when every muscle screamed to stop. In the end, America's true weapon was not a tank or a plane. It was the will of its people. The men who had been farmers, mechanics, factory workers, transformed into soldiers who could fight through exhaustion, through pain, through fear itself. Their training had been brutal, but it had made them unbreakable. At Camp Toccoa, at Fort Benning, at Quantico, and on the cliffs of Scotland, they had learned that courage wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about mastering it, about acting anyway even when every instinct said run. And when history tested them they proved what that meant. They were the embodiment of the American spirit, ordinary people who became extraordinary because the times demanded it. It wasn't glory that drove them. It was duty. They didn't fight for medals or recognition. They fought because someone had to. Because somewhere out there, another unit depended on them, another man needed cover, another flag needed to stay standing. That was the quiet heroism of their generation, the belief that the impossible could be done if you just refused to quit. And in that belief, America found its victory. Years later, when the war stories became legends and the photographs turned sepia, the veterans grew old. They walked a little slower, spoke a little softer. But if you looked closely you could still see it, that fire behind their eyes. It was the same look they had on the cliffs, in the jungles, on the beaches. The look of men who had faced death and decided to keep going. In the final years of their lives, some returned to the training grounds, to the windswept hills of Scotland, to the empty barracks of Camp Toccoa. They stood in silence, listening to the ghosts of their past. One old ranger knelt and touched the cold stone of a cliff face. His voice cracked as he whispered, "We were just kids. But we did it." And somewhere above the wind, it almost felt like the cliffs whispered back. The lesson of their generation was simple but eternal. Hardship reveals character. The harder the trial, the stronger the spirit. It was that belief, that strength forged in struggle, that carried America through its darkest hour. Because when the war demanded everything, they gave it. When hope seemed lost, they built it. And when the world broke apart, they held the line. Those who trained to endure the impossible became the reason freedom survived. Every generation since has lived under the shadow of their endurance. The idea that greatness is not given but earned in sweat, pain, and sacrifice. The soldiers of World War II proved that victory begins long before the first shot is fired. It begins in the discipline to wake before dawn, to run until your legs give out, to climb until your hands bleed, and then to keep going. That is how America won the war. Not because it had the most tanks or planes or factories, but because it trained its people to be unstoppable, to endure the unimaginable, to rise from nothing again and again. It was the triumph of will over fear, of spirit over circumstance. And in that victory lay the true heart of America, a nation that refused to break. So the next time you see an old photograph, a young soldier grinning in mud-stained fatigues, a paratrooper crouched in the door of a C-47, a ranger halfway up a cliff, remember what it took to make that image real. Every drop of sweat, every tear, every scream from those training grounds became part of the story that shaped the world. Because before they were heroes, they were just men. And what made them heroes was how they trained to never give up. The camera lingers on the cliffs, now calm, silent, washed by the same sea that once carried them to war. The wind hums softly, echoing across time. They trained not to survive, the voice says quietly, but to win. Pause. And they did. Fade to black. If you felt the weight of their story, the endurance of those who refused to yield, join us. Subscribe to the channel and keep exploring the untold truth behind the men who built victory from hardship. Their legacy deserves to be remembered.